This episode is brought to you in part by Museum of the Bible and its new worship experience, All Creation Sings, made in partnership with Creator. Step into an immersive room with vibrant visuals, soundscapes of praise, and interactive displays illuminating the story of worship. Get tickets at museumofthebible.org/ACS.
Welcome to the Grace Enough podcast. I am your host, Amber Cullum, and this week I sit down with Meghan Newkirk. We discuss living with and learning to manage obsessive-compulsive disorder as a real diagnosis, and not just socially acceptable quirks we often label as OCD. We also discuss specific challenges she has faced, ways Christians can support people living with OCD, and why she wrote Loving Naomi, a Christian fiction book where the main character has OCD. Meghan gives us a precious gift today, a glimpse into her as both a follower of Jesus and a woman living with obsessive-compulsive disorder. I know you will walk away with a deeper, maybe a new understanding of this mental health diagnosis. Good morning, Meghan. Welcome to the Grace Enough podcast.
Good morning. How are you doing this morning?
I'm good. We've had a few little technical issues, but here we are ready to go.
We're ready. Yes.
That's right. Well, welcome, and tell everybody a little bit about yourself, your family, and what you do on a day-to-day basis.
All right. So I am Meghan Newkirk, and I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina. I've grown up here. I'm the mother of three wonderful children. I am a Wolfpack NC State grad and have been living here and loving Raleigh. I've got all kinds of family here. I'm currently a stay-at-home mom and aspiring author. So these days with COVID, I've been home with virtual kids for the last year. So it's been a little bit different. Learning how to juggle the desire to publish a book and have kids home from school. But I've been very blessed to have family close for, help and just doing my writing thing. So
well, today we're going to talk a little bit about the book that you have recently published and your journey with OCD. And so OCD is, often thought of culturally as just this socially acceptable quirk. I know I'm guilty at times of saying, oh, that's my OCD quality, that we want things a certain way. But it is a real diagnosis that can have devastating consequences. And so as we begin to discuss obsessive compulsive disorder, will you share what it was like for you growing up and some of the symptoms that you experienced that led to a diagnosis of OCD in your life?
So I was not actually clinically diagnosed until college. But I had symptoms as early as 8 years old. I had my appendix out. I had it rupture when I was 8 and was in the hospital due to some infection caused by that. And my parents have said that was sort of the turning point for me, where I crossed over from being a more cautious child to something a little bit different. And so the symptoms kind of grew slowly. It started as a big need for reassurance from my mom about kind of some outlandish fears. And then as puberty hit, it began to have more narrow focuses. So very specific themes that were repeating themselves in my fears. That's very common with OCD. And then remarkably, and by God's grace, made it, through high school successfully. And then it wasn't really until college that I realized that these patterns of behavior were unhealthy. I had met at that time who became my future husband, and I realized that couldn't continue with those types of compulsions and still maintain my relationship with him in a healthy way. So that's what ultimately led me to counseling. And at the time, counseling was not as common as it is now.
Right.
It was viewed in my eyes as more of a punishment than an actual aid. And so that's what kind of took me so long to finally get help. But some of the symptoms, so they kind of grew gradually. So as a child, I would worry about things I think that typical kids worry about. But as it moved into middle school, I started becoming very fearful of germs, very fearful of certain intrusive thoughts, as they're called, where you might think about something in a way that's disruptive, very extreme. Sometimes they have to do with whether you would hurt someone or, feelings you might have that feel very abnormal. And, during puberty, you're feeling and experiencing all kinds of things. So the wires get crossed and thoughts that normally would just pass through get stuck. And so with OCD, it can be very challenging to be able to figure out what's normal, what's not. So you get stuck and you get on that hamster wheel. And for me, in middle school, for instance, I would walk through the halls and I would feel myself becoming quote unquote contaminated by the dirtiness and the messiness and the filth of the school, and would become very obsessed with that feeling of wanting to feel clean. So the hand washing for me was a problem at that point. That's a very stereotypical fear of OCD, but not everybody has that. I want to be clear about that because I think a lot of people just assume, well, I don't have OCD because I don't obsess about washing my hands or about cleanliness, but that's not actually a requirement for having OCD. For me, that happened to be the case. And so as I got older, it became clear that I was also obsessing about harming others, fearful of what I could potentially do to someone else, thoughts about that. This idea that your thoughts have power, that, if you think something, it can affect a circumstance, or, that if I think that my dad was going to get in a car accident and I all of a sudden would get this intrusive thought of my dad getting into a car accident, that somehow that was going to then cause a car accident, and I would obsess about it until my father would actually pull in the driveway. So that was another aspect. And then there's very commonly the religious subtype, scrupulosity, moral OCD is what it's called, where you just kind of obsess about being a good person. What does it look like to do the right thing? Will God cast me to hell if I think about something, if I get angry at him, or if I say something in a certain way or don't do something in a certain way? And it's very individual and specific for each person. There are a lot of what they call sub-themes to OCD. So they're all in the same kind of vein in that it attacks what you value the most. So oftentimes it will attack, if someone loves children, oftentimes they will have POCD, which is one of the more difficult ones to deal with.
What does the P stand for?
For pedophile, actually, OCD.
Okay.
And it's a very, very specific one that it can be very, very paralyzing for people because OCD attacks what you love. So, for me, the idea of being sick, I'm a 7 on the Enneagram.
Yeah.
So I care.
You want to have all the fun.
I want to have all the fun and I don't want to have any suffering. So for me, the fear of suffering is why my OCD, kind of hooked into that.
Okay.
And so, then you've got the scrupulosity, the moral OCD. So being a good person, people who tend to be very conscientious people, that's something that can kind of happen for them, but it can tap into any aspect of your life. So order, that's why I think a lot of times stereotypically people think about it in that way, because it's good to be orderly. It's good to want things. But if you feel like if you don't have it in a certain way that something's going to happen, then it can become paralyzing.
Well, and that's something I was going to ask, what is the difference between just having that tendency of, I like things orderly, and then what's the next step? So it sounds like what you're saying is the next step is, even though I want things orderly and it drives me crazy when they're not, I don't it doesn't have to happen. And I'm not afraid that there's going to be this horrible outcome if it's not orderly. Is that the difference?
Yes, very much so. And it also, I think there's also kind of a vein of OCD as far as a personality, like someone who just happens to like things to be orderly and in control versus someone who has a diagnosis. Now, I don't know that that's an actual thing, but I know that, you can meet a lot of people with OCD the diagnosis who are extremely messy, because when things become quote unquote contaminated, they just push them to the side and say, well, I'm just going to put this over here because, if something from the outside world is a contaminant and it contaminates something that then comes into your home, you're not going to want to deal with that thing. So it can very easily become a hoarding situation. So, when people say, oh, I'm so OCD, I've had more people tell me when I tell them I wrote a book about OCD that, oh, I have OCD. That. And I'm like, well, are you tortured by your thoughts? That's my first question. Like, because there's a big difference between, oh, I feel so good when this is ordered versus I am tortured by my own brain and my brain doesn't ever shut off. And I think given those other specific categories, and there's another one I forgot about too, which is relational OCD. And relational OCD is one that I actually did suffer from, which is in the book quite a lot. And that is very concerned with how you make others feel, what you say to them, how your relationship plays out with them. So you obsess a lot about what you've said, what you've done, how it's affected that person, and becomes paralyzing because, I'm an extrovert. I love to be with people, but I would go out with my friends and I'd come home and just obsess about, what did I say? How did I say it? Let me follow up with them and ask for reassurance. And, let me make sure that I didn't hurt their feelings. And so that's another way that, I think people might say, well, oh, I care about what people think too. Sure. But it's when it crosses over into that obsessive, and the compulsion is then asking for reassurance.
Well, and so when you were in middle school and high school, do you remember, did you think, well, everybody goes through this?
I think I didn't really know. I felt very abnormal. I did not feel like, oh, I'm just like everybody else. Because in middle school, I had on the backs of my hands, a lot of times people with OCD will try to ground themselves in an unhealthy way to stop the intrusion of the thoughts. So for me, and this is also mentioned in the book, I would take my fingernails and kind of dig them into the back of my hand as a way to like ground myself. Okay, I don't want to think.
It's the sensory input.
Yes. So it's like, I don't want to think these things. And so since I wasn't in counseling, I didn't know how to ground myself in a healthy way. Yeah. So I was, trying to do that. And so I think for me, I walked around with my sleeves pulled down, what's on your hands? Why, I also would do a little bit of talking to myself to try to stop the thoughts. Yeah. Asking God to please no, like, please stop. So a lot of times people would go, who are you talking to? So I didn't do a very good job. Yeah. Of hiding my struggle. And so as a result of that, I felt very much like I was set apart from other people. Now, my parents did a fantastic job of using my struggle to point me to Christ. And so in that, they never made me feel like I was somehow different. So they were a counterbalance to that, which was wonderful and a huge blessing.
Well, and I could see how at that age it could get crossed a little bit because there are so many things already going on in your mind and in your life that are just normal parts of being a teenager that it's hard to like learn at that time. And I'm sure for parents as well, even get to the point where, is this something that's like seriously wrong? Or is this just the way that she is going through puberty?
Exactly. And kids in middle school and high school, they go through stuff.
It's crazy.
Yeah. You don't know what you're going to get all the time. And so I think my mom just felt like, well, this is a phase and it'll pass. And there were seasons, I think with OCD, there are seasons of quiet. And so we'd go through a season of quiet and then it would ramp up again. And of course we didn't have a name for it. So she just thought I had a busy brain and, I had anxiety, but it's a fine line with OCD. It's a very specific type of fear and worry.
I want to take a moment to tell you about one of my new favorite small businesses, Green Roof Gallery. I came across Bethany and her unique handcrafted leather earrings when a friend shared Green Roof Gallery on Instagram. Green Roof Gallery creates leather accessories for the grown-up girl who loves simplicity and a natural style. handcrafted, small batched, unique, and personal. Bethany parallels the process of leather work with the new creation theme found throughout the Bible. God takes our seemingly unusable mess-ups and makes them new and unexpectedly beautiful. When you wear jewelry or use a journal from Green Roof Gallery, you will be gently reminded that God takes the hard and ugly times and uses them for our good and His glory. You will know every product went through some not so pretty times to get to the beautiful finished piece that now belongs to you or the person you might gift it to. And let me say, I own 2 pairs of the teardrop leather earrings. And when they arrived, I was beyond impressed by the detail of the design and the beauty of the color which Bethany hand paints. Plus, Bethany was quick to respond to my questions, and she cares deeply about helping women own their whole stories while seeking God throughout. As a Grace Enough podcast listener, you can take 15% off through July and August using the code GRACE15. Go to Etsy.com and search Green Roof Gallery. At checkout, use the code GRACE15 for 15% off your entire purchase. You can also learn more on Instagram and Facebook by searching Green Roof Gallery. Well, let's move into a little bit about the way Christian culture tends to deal with things like this. You know, we can just get really, really uncomfortable. And praise the Lord, I do feel like that's typical in society as well. And so I do see that Christian communities and cultures are beginning to come along as well to pay attention to mental, disorders, diagnoses, those types of things.
Right.
But at the same time, it I don't even know what all I want to say about that, and I need to be careful. But there is this idea in the Christian world sometimes where we want to slap Band-Aids on stuff and just say, oh, pray more. Oh,
Right.
Surrender to God more, and things will be okay.
Right.
And so what was that like for you growing up, and kind of how do you address that now when you maybe see that taking place, or you're just in a position where you can educate the
Right.
Christian world how to respond?
I think a lot of times what happens with people like myself who have this type of a diagnosis, I think it's easy to just kind of take scripture and misapply it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what often happens is not so much the fault of the church even, but just the actual like desire of the heart of the sufferer. And so you read, like be anxious for nothing or do not worry about tomorrow. And you think, okay, well, this is what I'm commanded to do. Why is it that I desire so much for God to meet me there, and I just keep doing these same patterns and these same rituals, and I don't know how to not be fearful about it. And so I think what can be hard in the church setting is that if you happen to have poor guidance of someone who just says, because I think on average, telling someone who doesn't suffer from these things to not worry about tomorrow and to call on God and all of those things, that's good. That's good stuff.
Yeah.
And oftentimes people with OCD, if you think about the categories of fears that I mentioned, some of them I struggled with, some of them I didn't. Some are way harder. I mean, given the idea of like POCD, I mean, that's not something you're going to go and want to talk about
Right.
with your friends or your pastor. And so I think there's this idea that there's some shame behind it. And
Mm-hmm.
so they may go to their pastor and say, I'm really worrying. And they're not going into the nitty gritty of what that looks like. And so I think, what would be helpful, I think, is for people in the church to press into that and learn about what OCD looks like specifically so that they can ask the right questions to be able to say, okay, well, let's just we rule this out so that, you're not doing more harm than good by saying, hey, I want you to go home and pray these verses. And then, because then what can happen is then that becomes the compulsion. That becomes the thing that's supposed to
Yeah.
fill it all in. And that's not what God intends with his scripture. And, I've joined quite a few OCD Christian support groups on Facebook and such. And what I see is this kind of, pastors telling people, Satan's attacking you and I'm like, no, you need a therapist and you need medication. Like that.
Amen, girl.
Like, this is
Satan's
not
attacking us all.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, sure. He's probably using this. Right. Absolutely. Just like he's, using all kinds of other things, but
that's right. But it's a real diagnosis.
Exactly. And so I think that's where I get frustrated, and I'm thankful that I can jump on there and say, hey, what you're dealing with is chemical. It's the way your brain was created, which is wonderful and different. And God can use this. I think that's where education comes in, and just pastors being able to say, like, if someone comes into my office and uses these certain types of words that can be red flags, that, hey, I need to point this person to a professional, and not just any professional, but a professional who understands obsessive compulsive disorder, because it takes a specific type of treatment. So I think that's where, I don't think anyone's doing anything intentionally.
Right.
I think it's just a lack of understanding of the differences that are between regular anxiety and OCD itself.
Well, and I love that you said at the beginning of that it's not just on the church, that part of a believer, a follower of Jesus, is this own desire to, read, like you said, and then be like, oh, but God, what I see here is this is a command. Like, you tell us not to do these things.
Right.
And so then we get obsessed with, well, I'm trying not to do these things and I'm praying about these things, but they're not going away.
Right.
When that's where, as Christians too, I think we have to be so careful to look at the whole canon of scripture and see that, we're commanded to do these certain things. But if you look at characters throughout God's word, they clearly struggled with those things. Like, it wasn't like they didn't exist. It says, do not be anxious, but we see people be anxious all through scripture.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a continual type of surrender and paying attention to, just because you're commanded to do that doesn't mean that you're not. It's just, this may be the battle that you're facing for your life.
Right. Exactly. Well, and not only that, but that God can use our shortcomings and and he does. He totally does all the time. And, I think that, I think what's been the most amazing for me is to now I'm actually thankful for my OCD. And I think that that's not where everybody's going to be. It's a process. It doesn't always come overnight, but for me, it has kept me on my knees. And so I think reminding me that these struggles that we have, whether it be with anxiety or physical suffering or circumstantial or whatever, that, these are God's, they're for our good and his glory, and they don't feel good all the time. And I think just remembering that, but understand, and that's why it's so important to understand what the gospel is and to understand it correctly, because if you don't, you can get lost in the, but I have to's, but if I don't, then, but what if? And I think with OCD, you can call it the but what if disease diagnosis. You are but what ifing everything. I mean, it's like, but if I this, or but if I that, and you can change and mold. And, our relationship with God is a process. And so I think we so want that feeling with OCD, especially, you want that feeling of something to be just right. And, our relationship with Christ is only just right because he's just right, not because of anything that we do, or, so I think that's where, I have to fall with my faith. And actually one of my favorite verses is, 2 Corinthians 12:9. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. That has kind of been my theme, because my mom used to tell me that, because I would just say, like, well, my faith's not enough, or I'm not, I'm still worried about this or whatever. And she'd say, look, God works through our weaknesses. He's not working only through the strong people. He's working through our weaknesses.
That's right.
So I think for me, that has been just a comfort for people who I've met who struggle with OCD or with even just extreme anxiety or panic or whatever. That has been my mantra, because I think OCD really does attack your character. Like I said before, it attacks what you value most. And so you start to believe, am I these things? Am I a murderer? Am I am I going to do these things to someone else? Or am I really a blasphemous person who hates God, and so I
Mhm.
think it's so important for us to remember that God is not a labeler. We are made in his image,
Mm.
and the only thing we need to label ourselves with is that we are a child of him, period. And that can be a really hard
Yeah.
thing to settle on when you have OCD. So that's why it's so important to get good counsel.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that too, when we were talking a little bit just back and forth via email about God and really how he views our struggles, that I found just really interesting as I was thinking through. You were so gracious to send me some things that you feel like people need to know about OCD. And so, as you started working through this in college, um, how did you kind of do that mindset shift of God views my struggle? You
Mm-hmm.
just said, he views weakness as a way for us to show his sufficiency of grace
Mm-hmm.
in our lives. But even in how you view the word and the sufficiency of Christ for our struggles, is there anything else that you would share to that?
I think the important thing is to use your, kind of separate. This is going to sound interesting, but kind of separate your faith from your treatment in a way. Um, I actually went to a counselor who was not a believer for a long, long time. She was an OCD expert, but she used my faith as a tool. And yeah, she
I love
used it as a
that.
tool. She knew it was a part of who I was. But I think in kind of coming out, because I was so obsessed with, God casting me away, when I was able to kind of separate him from that process of treatment. So I would just say that, you know, if if you are obsessed with scripture in an unhealthy way, like say you have to read something a certain amount of times, I think it's just understanding that God understands the process of getting better from OCD, and sometimes that means you have to do something that feels like what your pastor would tell you not to do. And maybe he might say like, no, you only need to read your Bible once today. You don't need to read it 12 times. That's going to feel very counter what the right thing to do is.
Intuitive.
So I think it's just important to trust um, in what your therapist is saying about what's good for your treatment, even because it's
Mhm.
going to feel unnatural. It's going to feel like the wrong thing to do. And I think when it applies to our faith, which is what we're talking about right now, like if your worries involve your faith, I think just understanding that God has so much grace for this process of treatment, and to just rest in that
Mm.
he's going to use the difficulties of that, and eventually you will be able to go back to the word and not look at it compulsively. So I hope that speaks to the question that you were asking.
Well, it's interesting because what I love about that is, um, I've told people time and time again to not get caught up in thinking that because someone is not a biblical counselor, that there's nothing
Oh,
useful
right.
you can
Yes.
receive from them. And I say that because I have come to a place in faith of all people are created in the image of God. And it's something that Hillary Ferrer said to me, who she is one of the authors of Mama Bear
Love that book.
Apologetics. And I love that. Yeah, it's amazing. And what she said on the show was, we have to remember that there's no Christian that is so quote unquote saved and good that heresy cannot come
Right.
out of their mouth. And there's no person who is so quote unquote lost that we can't receive something
Right.
good from them. And that is all
Right.
God in man. And so I think sometimes when we think about fallen nature, we've taken it to this extreme where we think, oh, there must be nothing good, lovely, admirable,
Right.
praiseworthy, noble in somebody that's not a follower of Jesus. And I'm like, whoa, 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 that is not what that
Right.
scripture says. Like, we need to learn to identify those things in all people and still realize they need Jesus. And
Yeah.
so, I appreciate that about counseling, because going to somebody who specializes in exactly what your diagnosis is
Hmm.
matters.
Yes, it does. It really does, especially with OCD, because really for OCD, the I don't want to say the perfect combo, but the best combo is what's called exposure prevention. So you basically are, you know, like for me, I went through ERP, and I had to purposefully expose myself to things that I was afraid of.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, whether or not she was giving me the task with my faith involved, she wasn't saying you're going to take your daughter. Cause one of my exposures was I had to take my daughter and put her in a grocery cart and walk her around the store. Cause I hated grocery carts. They were disgusting to me. And I just did not ever, so I did anything I could to prevent that. And my therapist said, you have to put your daughter in the cart and you have to walk around the store until because you kind of number your anxiety. So it's like 1 to 10. So, say my OCD anxiety for that task was a 7, I'd have to walk around the store until it was a 4. That was and then you kind of work through until,
right.
So I had to do it. My palms were sweaty and I did not want to do it. And I was gritting my teeth the whole time. And I had a lovely panic attack, but I was also praying the entire time. And God was meeting me in that. And my therapist didn't know that was going to be kind of my go-to thing, but I was just going, Lord, just meet me in this, but I know this is what I have to do. Whether or not I was praying or not, that was the technique that needed to happen for me to get better. Yeah. I had to face that fear. Now, will I tell people with OCD that if you have a faith that going through ERP is going to be way easier? Yes, because he will meet us in those challenges. And it is without a doubt an opportunity for you to grow in your faith. But you need to have someone who can look at you and say, we're going to make a list of your top fears and we're going to work through all of these things. And that means you got to stick your hand in that trash can, or you have to, not call your mom 15 times a day to ask her for reassurance, or whatever that thing is. You have to have somebody that's going to be able to work through the practical sides of doing that.
That's right.
And whether you're a believer or not,
that's right.
And so I think it's an opportunity. And I think for me with my counselor, I was able to be a witness to her. I mean, right. I told her, I said, look, my faith is a huge part of who I am. And how can we integrate this? And so she would start saying, okay, now you speak to the religious piece of this, and you're going to be doing this task. And how do you want God to fit into that? And I would say, well, I want to be able to only pray a couple times during this or whatever. So yeah, I mean, I think it's extremely important to understand, especially for pastors or even biblical counselors, that, if you have a patient that you just like, I don't know what to do with this, like, you got to find somebody who's been trained in this, because it's very specific and it needs a very, you got to have the right medication and you got to have the right homework. So
yeah, I don't say what I said earlier to say, like, don't go to biblical counseling. I think that's great too.
Yep.
I just think that we can quickly discount people, and
absolutely,
that is not okay.
Well, and I'll be honest with you. Like, I went to my counselor for a long time who was not a believer. And I love her to death. And then I realized she was actually retiring. And I realized, like, I think there's a part of this that I'm not getting to. And so now my counselor is a Christian counselor. And because I've done the practical work, and now there's a deeper part. And
right.
So, therapy changes. Every season is different, but you got to know the tools and you got to be able to change them up, and you got to bring the desire to do the work.
That's so true. And I mean, with Christianity and our personal relationship with Jesus, it's so awesome that you have community as well. And I don't want to discount that not everybody has a supportive family, or a family, you might have a supportive family, but they don't necessarily share your faith values. And so you got to really think through and realize that there's no one-stop shop. There's no quick fix. There's a lot of work that goes into it. So
that's what sanctification looks like.
Until the day of Christ Jesus, girl.
Seriously.
It's so true. Well, you wrote Loving Naomi, a Christian fiction book whose character lives with OCD. And so tell everybody, what was your purpose in writing that book and in really choosing to make it fiction?
So the story behind this is all God, as everything is. But I actually am a big reader, and I love reading fiction. I love reading nonfiction too, but fiction is really my main, like, if I really want to like feed my soul, fiction is just the way that I want to do that. And I decided to kind of randomly read books about characters with OCD. I had heard that there were some books written, and there was one in particular that I read, and I just really wanted to kind of see how the world was being presented with this idea of OCD, mostly because I knew that someday my kids were going to ask me, and I'm very well treated now. And so they don't even really sometimes see it. They don't, yeah, it's an internal thing. And so I thought, well, someday I want to explain this to them. So I thought, well, I'll just read some books and maybe I can give them a book because I learned through fiction. I read one in particular that was really, really good. And when I got finished with it, I thought, wow, he did such a good job of articulating what OCD feels like. And of course, you can't, when you write a book about, unless you're writing a nonfiction that talks about all the different sub themes. I mean, there are a million different ways that OCD can present itself in a person. The cycles are the same, the obsessing and then the compulsing to relieve the anxiety is the same, regardless of the theme. But it can look lots of different ways and present itself. So he picked one particular way and he did a fantastic job of articulating it. But at the end of it, the character was kind of like, well, sometimes she was doing well and sometimes she wasn't. And that's the end of the story. And I was like,
no hope.
Where's the hope? Like there's no any big picture. And so I thought, well, I'll just, write a short story for my kids, kind of loosely based on my own experiences. So I kind of had this fiction story in my mind. And I thought, well, I'll take characters that are sort of planted with a theme of my family and the people who have spoken into my life. And I started writing, and then it got away from me. And it went from being a short story to a novel, which I didn't even realize till I Googled, how long is a short story? And I was like, oh, I think I went a little overboard. And so that's kind of how it was born. And I have always been a very imaginative person and have loved to tell stories and write stories and pretend and all that stuff. So for me, it was really fun to do. And I think God has surprised me along the way with how it turned out. But yeah, that's kind of how it started, is just kind of my desire to communicate with my children my own experiences with the disorder in a way that would be more entertaining.
Yeah. And so what do you hope now that you have this book that's out there? Like if someone, reads it and comes to you and says, this is what I thought about the book. Like if you could have one of your, perfect responses, what do you think? I shouldn't say perfect, but something that you're just like, yes, that was my why.
Yeah.
What would you hope they say about it?
My why would be, I would hope that someone would come to me and say that God can use even OCD, and that they would see that, because people who have OCD feel shame. They feel embarrassed. They feel like, why is my brain having these thoughts? They're thoughts that you never want to say out loud. And I just want somebody to read it and go there's two things I would hope that they would say. One is from someone who actually has OCD. Like, I just want them to go, wow, I'm not alone and I can live with this, and God can use it. And it can be something that is for my good. I want that to be one. And then the second goal would be for people who love someone with OCD to not feel guilt and shame over being exhausted with them. Because it is exhausting to love someone who needs constant reassurance or who is doing these things that just don't make sense. And so I think for me to have someone come to me and say, oh my gosh, I read this book and I felt heard, that it's okay that I am tired, but that, I can still love them. And also that there are solutions. I want the book to bring solutions to people. I want people to say, okay, if I do go to therapy, I'm going to get help, and I think I want them to read the book and read her experience of being so resistant to therapy, and then the blessings that came from that. I want them to read it and go, wow, I don't need to be ashamed of needing therapy. I don't need to be ashamed of the things I'm going to say there. That's a really long answer. There's a lot of hopes I have for this book.
No, I think that's awesome though.
So
that really communicates what your desires are. So I appreciate that. Well, like you said earlier, you are a mom of 3, you're a wife. And so what are some of the challenges of being a wife and a mom, and even some of the challenges that your family experiences as living with someone with OCD?
Having kids is the greatest exposure therapy for me in the germ department, because kids are gross and they come home with all kinds of stuff. And I think this last year of coronavirus has been sort of a sweet spot for me, because I've used strategies. And so COVID didn't really freak me out very much because I've already spent my whole life thinking that germs were going to kill me. So this was just another, I'm like, hey.
So you're like, hey, everybody's doing what I've been doing for like 20 years.
But, and so exactly. And so I'm like, so for my brain, I would say the greatest challenge currently, my brain, the society is now telling me what I've spent 10 years trying to work hard not to believe.
Yeah.
And so for me, re-entry into regular life is going to be a challenge. I'm already kind of prepping for that because kids get sick. And it's good to put them in situations where they might get sick. For me, that feels very counterproductive. It feels wrong. And that's what OCD does. It makes you feel like this is not right. I have always struggled with putting my kids in the nursery or, you take a normal new mom's fears and you kind of put them on steroids. And that's what I've had to work through a lot. You take those
obsessing over them. That's what my husband was like, well, what do you think is the difference? And I was like, well, I think there's thinking about this and you want this. And then there's like getting to the point where you cannot shift your mind to anything else.
No.
It's like just all consuming.
Right. And the decisions of is it worth, keeping my kid in the nursery if somebody brings their kid and says, oh, they have allergies and they're running at the nose. And I'm like, okay, now I have to there's a lot of situations that happen that I think moms just feel a moment of anxiety and then they move through it and they go, well, it'll be fine. But for me, it's an intentional decision that I have to make where my favorite phrase that my counselor taught me was I have to walk away uncomfortable. Like I have to walk away uncomfortable with the possibilities that might come from this situation. And I mean, when I'd pick my kids up from school and they'd get in the car and they'd say, oh, Bobby barfed on the such and such, I'd be like, okay, take a break. It's a physical response for me that I have to actually really work through. So that's the greatest challenge for me now. God has been extremely merciful and I don't have the relational obsessions like I used to, but I'm also medicated. When I'm not medicated, that's a hard one. You can ask my sister. She is my go-to person and she just gets exhausted with me because it's just, my brain just never stops with, should I or would I, and the insecurities that come with that. And I mean, it becomes a real rat race. So thankfully God's been merciful in that area. And I don't have the same harm-based intrusive thoughts like I used to, which are covered in the book. I probably could if I wasn't still working as hard as I am. Constantly, intentionally. But I think God's been merciful in that. And I'm thankful that I can say that that's been one that I've, but I never get too comfortable because OCD is like whack-a-mole. And so you never know which one's going to pop up. And so
that's right.
I have to be on guard. And so I am. And
I mean, that's really any mental diagnosis. I mean, just being someone who struggles with depression, like, people will be like, what? I'm like, it's really hard because something can happen and just send you into this spiral.
Right.
And that's not everybody because sometimes like someone with depression just stays there.
Right.
But if you're someone who's treating it and you have healthy coping mechanisms that you've been taught through counseling, it does feel a little bit like whack-a-mole because you're like, holy cow, what just happened? Like, that shouldn't have sent me into a tailspin, and it did.
Right. Exactly.
So that's the brain definitely playing tricks on you.
Totally.
What about, would you say, and maybe you don't feel comfortable sharing this, but what are some of the challenges your husband faces?
Well, I think for him, he's known me for so long. And so he's kind of walked with me through it, which he's a very steady person, personality wise. He just doesn't get really flustered by much. But I think
praise God, my husband doesn't either.
I mean, I'm like, do you see the fire that's going on? And he's like, it'll be fine. And I'm like,
He doesn't feel it.
No, definitely not. But I think for him, he has to deal with me needing a lot of reassurance about our relationship, because I think, with OCD, you can fill in the blanks very easily. And so for me, I can look at our relationship and go, there's a problem here. And he's like, where's the problem? Like, I don't see a problem. I think we probably could afford to spend some more time together, or, he'll have a very practical, but for me, if I don't get that reassurance from him that I really should be getting from Christ, if I don't get that from him, I can become obsessive about it. And that can get exhausting. The germ thing definitely does get exhausting for him, because many years ago, before I was medicated, we would have our community group at someone's home. And I think every single time we would go, this is when we had toddlers, I would have a
Yeah.
panic attack like on the way to community group. And I'd be like, I don't want to go. I don't want to go. I don't want to go. And he'd be
Mm.
like, we need to go. And so he had to kind of ride that roller coaster. And then once I would get there and the anxiety would fall and it would be, but he was basically doing an exposure for me. Like,
That's
um,
right.
and it's hard sometimes because sometimes it is right to say we shouldn't go because so-and-so is sick or, and so it's hard to know. And that's what's so frustrating with OCD is that OCD is based on good things. It's
Mm.
based on things that are important to think about. I mean, cleanliness and germs
Right.
and even you don't want to be a murderer. That's an important thing not to be. And so they're based on really good things to avoid. But I heard a really great analogy the other day that instead of looking at your OCD as this enemy that's lying to you, you should look at it as a really overly cautious friend that is sending you alarms to be aware of something or concerned about something when it's totally unnecessary. So to
Mm.
acknowledge it and say, "Hey, thank you for that warning. Thank you for alerting me that this is important." Like, but I don't need that right now. Like, I've got this
Oh,
under control. And I just found that so helpful because recognizing that it can be a blessing. I mean, our greatest strengths are our greatest weaknesses. And so,
yeah.
recognizing the fact that being a conscientious person, if say you have moral OCD and you're very concerned about doing the right thing, that's a great thing to want to love others well. But when the alarm is going off and you're doing all these things
Yeah.
compulsively to be a good person, you got to tell that friend, like, hey, I appreciate you looking out for me, that you want me to love other people well, but this is too much. And we got
Mm.
to press pause. And I hear you, but I'm not going to entertain that right now. And
Mm.
so for me, I have a thank you for bringing up this germ that's something I need to acknowledge that my kids could get sick and that could be really inconvenient and not fun. But there's these other factors that are more important than that right now. And I need you to just take a little break. And so that's kind of where I am currently with my OCD.
Yeah.
Um,
Just a
yeah,
healthier way of dealing with it. Well, as we
exactly.
begin to close out, you have talked a lot about how you need reassurance. That's a really typical thing for people with OCD.
Right.
And so, family members, friends, strangers who maybe don't know you as well are very tempted to provide that reassurance. But what is the danger in that? And what are some alternative ways to really reassure someone with OCD?
So I would say the reason why reassurance doesn't work is because it is a temporary, it's like, it's almost like an addiction in a
I
way,
was
and
gonna
that
say, does it feed an addiction?
it
Interesting.
does. It totally does. It tells the brain when someone reassures you, it tells the brain that this is an important problem that needs to get solved. And so it just reinforces the going back to it. And it trains the brain to think, okay, this is an emergency. So if somebody says, like, if I ask my mom, like, Mom, I thought this thought, is it a bad thought? And she says, no, honey, it's not a bad thought. And then I say, but are you sure it's not a bad thought? Like every time she answers, yes, I'm sure it's not a bad thought, she's just reinforcing my brain that this is a problem and this is something that needs my attention. This is a problem that needs solving. I mean, because OCD, you feel very much like a detective. You're like, ooh, I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to have all the certainty in the world that this is true or this is not true or this is and sometimes people can even have what's called false memory OCD, where, and I've experienced this before, where you actually remember a situation completely wrong, and you don't
Wow.
trust yourself. You go, well, wait, did this happen or did this happen? And you just spend all of your time thinking about reliving that situation in your mind over and over.
Wow.
And the OCD really skews it. So if I keep going back and saying, I got to figure this out, it's just telling the brain that it's important when it's really
Mhm.
not. And so I think for people who love someone with OCD, just saying, like, hey, and that's why it's so important to get therapy. Let me just say that right now, because therapists, especially if you love someone with OCD, you need to go to that therapy session with or without them and say, how do I deal with this when this happens? And that's really because each situation is so different. But the essence is that you would just tell the person, look, I acknowledge this thought. I hear you. I'm sorry that this is hard for you right now, but I can't answer that with you for you. You have to sit in that uncertainty right now. And it feels very counterproductive because you're going to make that person very uncomfortable, because they're
Yeah,
going to
and
want to
frustrated.
feel, yeah, they're going to want to feel your compassion. And there's a way to be compassionate without filling up that void. And listen, I have a very close friend who has OCD, and she's in the midst of big struggles right now. I have even noticed, wow, I'm reassuring her. I'm doing this and I shouldn't be. And I got to figure out a different way. But when you love the person, it's so easy to just want to tell them, no, you're not those things. You're
That's
not those
right.
things you're worried. We know you. So I think it's learning those practical ways to sit with them in the discomfort without solving it for them.
Whew.
And it is especially with young children, I think it's really hard. But yeah, I mean, my favorite, I love Flannery O'Connor. And one of her quotes that I just love is, and I actually have a bracelet on that says it, it's engraved in it, but she says, I can with one eye squinted, take it all as blessing. And I think when you're dealing with OCD, you are going to have your eye squinted in discomfort. You're going to be cringing. You're going to be putting yourself in really uncomfortable situations that are going to feel terrible. But that's when you know that the treatment is working. So that's my encouragement, is that the more uncomfortable you are, and that God is still in it. He's not left you. You are not alone. He's using all of it. And we may not see it this side of heaven, but we can trust his promises that, he is with us and he will not leave us. And in those exposures that feel terrible, he will meet us in them.
I love that. Thank you so much. So the book is Loving Naomi. Where can listeners find it?
So you can find it at Amazon. There's an ebook available as well as a paperback copy. I think the hardbacks are actually on back order right now, but they should be, by the time this is airing, and they should be back. And you can also get it at www.westbowpress.com, and you can Google the title and you can get it there also. It's free shipping there also. And if you live in the area, I also can deliver an autograph. So you can follow me on Instagram at Meghan Newkirk Writes, and you can DM me if you want a autographed copy, and I'm happy to deliver those to those in the area.
That's so awesome. And it's great. If anybody wants to connect with Meghan, please hop over to Instagram and connect with her there. The book is really it is a wonderful writing. It's a wonderful piece. I'm with you. I love fiction when it's like telling a story. Well, I mean, they're all telling stories, but something specific, like someone's specific journey it really resonates with me. So thank you for being here today and for sharing about OCD with my audience and your writing.
Oh, well, thank you for this opportunity. I'm very excited to be able to do this because I'm super passionate about this topic.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you or someone you know is struggling with OCD, I want to encourage you to seek out a good counselor. If you are unsure how to do that, please reach out to me at graceenoughpodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you for listening to the Grace Enough Podcast. Tune in next time.